much do we love Jesus? Well, Jesus is talking about a person who is worthy of Jesus. What does that mean? Well, we're talking about salvation. You're not worthy of what Jesus has come to bring. You're not worthy of His salvation if you love your father or mother more than Jesus, or if you love your son or your daughter more than Jesus. This is always a good test to see just how strong our commitment and our allegiance to Jesus is. Because we look through the history of time, there are lots of people that have used family members as an excuse. You say the child says, well, my parents are not faithful to Jesus, therefore, that's one reason, I want to be with them and I want to encourage them. Or there have been lots of examples where a husband has told his wife, I don't want you spending time with those Christians. Or a wife is one who is trying to negatively influence her husband from being a faithful Christian, and parents influencing children in a negative way, and so on. If you want what Jesus has to offer, if you want the salvation that He has to bring, then you've got to love Him more than anything else. This is talking about the prioritizing that we have mentioned before. I have known a number of people who have made tremendous sacrifices in order to be a disciple of Jesus. I remember one particular woman that when she told her family that she wanted to put on her Lord Jesus in baptism, that they said, if you do that, you are no longer a part of this family. Well, because she was convinced that was the right thing to do, she went ahead and was baptized, and sure enough, her family did what they said that they were going to do, and she was kicked out of the family. No longer welcome to be a part of the family, to come to any of the family events from that day forward. There are people that love Jesus so much that they love them more than their own families, their own flesh and blood. When we have people that use excuses about, well, the reason that they're not attending church or the reason they're not doing this or that is because of family, Jesus says, you're not worthy of me. And then the second category, He says in verse 38, he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. All right, this is the third time actually that He uses the word worthy. You're not worthy of Him if you don't take up your cross. Now, notice that He says you're going to take up His cross. Every individual who wants to be a disciple of Jesus is going to have his own individual cross. It may not be the cross of conflict with the family, but nevertheless, there's still a cross that a person is going to have to bear. Now, Jesus is using a figure that certainly would have been very familiar to these people who have witnessed perhaps dozens of crucifixions, and it's a very typical thing for the executioners to require of those people to carry their own cross, even as Jesus did. Well, when we look at the teaching of Jesus here, He's saying, you take up your cross. This is the voluntary thing. You are choosing to put that cross upon your own shoulders. Those difficulties between family members, it could have been averted if someone would just deny their allegiance to Jesus and go along with what the family wanted to do. But yet, the person who is in love with Jesus and wants to follow Jesus, they're going to put Him first. They're going to prioritize where He is first, and others are second. When you think of teenagers and the pressure that teenagers have from other teens to smoke and to drink and to use alcohol and perhaps drugs, that's a tremendous pressure. And if the individual chooses not to do that, then that pressure that's put upon them is such that it's very difficult. But if the teen chooses to be loyal to Jesus, that's a cross that they're willing to bear, and Jesus says that you're worthy of me if that is the case. He also says, follow after me. You cannot follow after Jesus without having a cross on your back. You cannot be a disciple of Jesus unless a person is bearing that cross. Just like we've talked about in other passages, you have to count the cost, and sometimes there's a very high price to pay. Consider several verses. For example, notice what the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. That's what we have to do, is be a sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, another one where Paul there says, I've been crucified with Christ. He had a cross, didn't he? I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life in which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and delivered himself up for me. So Paul was one that was obviously willing to take up his cross, and he said that that's the way it is for those who are going to be a follower of Jesus. Well, that's obviously what Jesus himself is saying here. You have to take up your cross. Are you willing to do that? As a matter of fact, as we look at the parallel to this account in Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, there the word is added daily. Take up your cross daily. Every single day of our lives, our commitment to Jesus is going to have to be seen. We're going to have to be demonstrated to other people. We daily take up that cross. The cross is an instrument of death, and we are dying to self so that we can be alive to God. He says in verse 39, He who has found his life shall lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake shall find it. If our emphasis is on our welfare, then we're going to lose out. I want to do things my way. I want to live my life the way I want to live it, and I'm not going to have anybody tell me what to do. That Jesus says you're going to lose your life by having that sort of viewpoint. But if you lose your life for my sake, that simply means this is the way I would like to live, but I'm not going to live that way. Instead, I'm going to live for Jesus. If you do that, you're going to find your life. You're going to receive the blessings that Jesus have, and you're going to be able to receive life abundant here in John 10 and verse 10, and you're going to have the life to come, eternal life in heaven. That's the kind of life that you'll find. He says in verse 40, He who receives you receives me. He who receives me receives him who sent me. All right, the Father was the one that sent Jesus, so if you receive Jesus, then the Father is going to receive you. What does that say about the religious groups today that do not receive Jesus? Well, they're not going to be received by the Father. How could someone reject Jesus and still have a relationship with God? That just simply can't happen because Jesus is God's Son. Well, he says, if he who receives you receives me. The apostles were those that were sent by Jesus. They had their authority given to them by Jesus. And therefore, if we receive the apostle, we're receiving Jesus. Now, we have individuals today that say, I'm just going to follow what Jesus said in the Gospels, and I'm not so concerned about what Peter and Paul and John had to write in the other books of the New Testament. That cannot happen and still have a relationship with Jesus and the Father, because you have to receive those whom Jesus sent. If we receive Paul, if we receive Peter, and we receive John, then we're receiving Jesus as well. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20, Paul says that everything that was built upon the foundation laid by the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone. And so that's what the gospel is, and the truth is built upon the work of those men, with Jesus being the focal point. He says in verse 41, He who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. He who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. So when you receive someone in the name of a prophet, then the reward is going to be given you as well. Now, this is a very interesting teaching on the part of Jesus, because this shows that there are rewards that God has in store for those who help the prophets. We would assume that a prophet would receive a reward But what about those people that helped the prophet along his way? Now, earlier Jesus had instructed the disciples not to carry a money belt and not to bring the change of clothes and so on, because they were going to be taken care of. How does God feel about those people that take care of those workers? You're going to receive the prophet's reward. You receive a righteous man in the name of a righteous man, then you're going to receive the righteous man's reward. God recognizes the things that people do for His workers. Now, when you think about the import of this, and the second clause of that, he receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man, that one right there is talking about Jesus, then you're going to receive a righteous man's reward. So if somebody receives an apostle who is a righteous man, who is out there doing his work because of Jesus, then that person who received that individual is in fact going to receive the righteous man's reward. Well, think about the kind of support we are giving for those who are God's spokesmen, those who are preaching the gospel. There are many faithful gospel preachers out there, many missionaries in the mission fields who are trying to do the work of the Lord but don't have enough support. There have been those who have become discouraged and have had to quit their preaching of the gospel, although that was their first love and that's what they wanted to do, because they did not have enough support in order to take care of their own family. Well, we need to remember that when we support those who are preaching, then we're going to receive the reward that God has in store for those who are preaching the gospel, those who are righteous. He says in verse 42, "And whoever in the name of a disciple gives to one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward." Well, when we think of even the smallest of gifts, the smallest of sacrifices, they're not going to lose their reward. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10 is perhaps a good passage to help us with this, where he says, "God is not so unjust as to forget your service and the labors of love that you've done." If we're faithful, if we're helping other people, if we're trying to serve God by serving others, especially those who are preaching and proclaiming the name of Christ, then God sees that and God will reward us accordingly. All right, let's move on then and go to chapter 11. Now, chapters 11 and 12 are chapters that belong together because they follow the limited commission of chapter 10. And now they're going to show in chapters 11 and 12 the open and sometimes very violent rejection of Jesus' message. What happened when the disciples went out? Chapters 11 and 12 are going to give us a pretty good indication of the kind of reception that Jesus and the disciples received as they went out. Now this shows the disciples more directly the meaning that Jesus had in chapter 10 verses 17 through 25, when he talked about that you're going to be delivered up, you're going to be hated, and so on. All right, verse 1 says, "And it came about when Jesus had finished giving instructions." Now, remember what we said in the beginning when we were talking about the speech sections, that every speech section concludes with phraseology like this: when Jesus had finished giving these words, giving these instructions, or whatever. And so now the second of the speech sections in the Gospel of Matthew has now been concluded. And that particular speech section covered all of chapter 10. Okay? So now we're going to move on. And what do we expect to find in between this speech section? Following, miracles, and that's going to be some of the predominant things that take place in the next couple of verses, next couple of chapters. All right, when he had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. Jesus not only commissioned them to go do it, but he obviously went and did it himself. Now, when John in prison heard the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to them, "Are you the coming one, or shall we look for someone else?" Well, we did not know that all of the details of John's imprisonment, but we know that it was because of his work and the preaching that he was doing, especially some of the things that he was saying that had to do with the ruling powers. And so he was in prison, but he hears about the works of Jesus. And so he's locked up in a jail cell, and he sends his disciples to ask Jesus a very important question. Once again, here's the question, an interrogative in the Gospel of Matthew. This is what John wants to know. Are you the coming one, or should we look for someone else? Now, there are 4 possible explanations as to why John would have asked this. All right, let's consider these one at a time. The text does not tell us directly why he is asking this question, but let's consider what is behind John's thinking here. First, he was wanting Jesus to declare his messiahship more directly. Perhaps John felt like Jesus just wasn't being open enough about that. Second, he was having doubts in his own mind if Jesus was truly the Messiah. Maybe the depression that John feels in prison is illustrated in this possibility that he just was wondering if Jesus really was the Messiah. Maybe Jesus didn't do things even the way John thought he should do them. Third, he was wanting his disciples to now follow Jesus. Perhaps by having his disciples go and ask the question, this would be so the disciples would get a clue and get an idea that this is really what John wants them to do, to now go and follow Jesus. Or perhaps fourth, he was wondering if his task as the preparer was over. And if it was, maybe he could relax and go ahead and suffer the consequences of Herod in peace. And that his work is done, the preparer's work is over, and he has adequately prepared for the Messiah. Well, there could be a number of truths to any of these. You could see how there would be some truth. He could have had doubts, and there could have been some questions. But notice Jesus' response in verse 4. He answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and what you see." All right, so the disciples of John are being spoken to, and he says, now you've seen some things. Go back and tell John what it is that you have seen. Now there are 6 categories of Jesus' work that he is going to describe for the disciples. The blind receive sight. Secondly, he says the lame walk. Third, he says lepers are cleansed. Fourth, the deaf hear. Fifth, the dead are raised. And then finally, the gospel is preached to the poor. This is what's happening. This is what is going on right now. And so as a result of these, the disciples can go back, they can report this to John, and they can say, this is what's going on. John, who knows the Old Testament Scriptures, knows that the Messiah would in fact be doing all of these 6, working in all of these 6 areas. And so the fact that Jesus is doing this is proof positive that he is in fact the Messiah. Now, we said that the purpose of the Gospel of Matthew is to convince the Jew that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, these are the very things that Matthew has been given us all along. Have we not had examples of the blind receiving sight? Have we not seen the lame walk? Have we not seen lepers cleansed? Have we not seen those who are deaf hearing, the dead raised? And have we not seen the gospel being preached? Yes, to all of these questions. Up to this point, Matthew has given us examples, especially in the miracle chapters of chapters 8 and 9, of these events taking place. So what is Matthew doing? He's giving the evidences that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, there's a tie-in with all of this to the work of the Messiah. For example, the blind receiving sight. We go back to Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and following for evidence there. That's what the Messiah was going to do. He was going to give sight to the blind. Jesus is doing that. That's evidence that he's the Messiah. And then in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1 and following, having the poor receive the gospel. That's something that the Messiah was going to do. And so what Jesus says he's doing is what the Old Testament Scripture said the Messiah was going to be doing. Well, so how is this an answer to John's question? By the fulfilling of Old Testament Scriptures, doing things and underscoring those things that would be characteristic of the Messiah. It's interesting that Jesus doesn't directly answer the question. He doesn't say, now you go back to John and you say, yes, Jesus said that he is the Messiah. Well, that's not the way Jesus chose to answer it. He wants people to think about it. He wants them to examine the evidence and then come to a conclusion based upon that evidence. And then he goes on and says in verse 6, and blessed is he who keeps from stumbling over me. The one who understands the work will not take exception to the way Jesus goes about doing it. If they understand and they appreciate what it is that Jesus is trying to accomplish, then that's going to be something that will be a stepping stone, not a stumbling block. Jesus is not fitting the mold. Even John might have had some questions about the way that Jesus was doing things. But as Lord, we have to yield to Jesus' way of doing things, the way of Jesus taught things. We may not always agree with some of the things that Jesus teach, or we might wish that things could be different. But that's the recognizing the lordship of Jesus. He says, if you're not going to put me first, you're not worthy of me. Let's remember this point when we consider a number of things that occur within our own lives that we know that are contradictory to the teachings of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 19, we're going to be talking again about the problem of marriage and divorce and what are reasons that Jesus gives for a person divorcing and remarrying. A lot of people do not like what Jesus says there. And there are many people that are trying to twist and distort what Jesus teaches about marrying and divorcing and having the right to remarry. When Jesus says, blessed are those that keep from stumbling over me, you have to take Jesus for what he says, follow him the way he wants to be followed. All right, and verse 7 says, and as these were going away, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, what did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind, but what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' palaces. But why did you go out? To see a prophet? Yes, I tell you, and one who is more than a prophet. So Jesus takes advantage of their curiosity about John, and since a question had just come from John, who is in prison, Jesus takes a moment to talk about the work of John. What did they expect to see when they went out to see John? Some soft guy that was wearing king's clothing and stuff like that? No, John was not that kind of man. Did they go out expecting to see a powerful prophet? Well, yeah, they went out to see a prophet, but John was more than a prophet. In what way was John more than a prophet? Because no prophet was able to do what John was able to do, and that was to be the preparer, be the one that prepared the way for the Messiah. So John had a very, very special place in God's plan. The Gospel of John would further bear that out. All right, he says, this is the one about whom it was written, behold, I send my messenger before your face. He will prepare your way before me. All right, this is a passage that goes back to Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. This was an unquestionable messianic context. And those people that are listening to this would see that Jesus is, in this way, being about as direct of announcing that he is the Messiah as any other passage that we might find. All right, because Malachi 3:1 says that there was going to be someone who was a preparer for the coming one, for God's anointed, for the Messiah. Well, Jesus says John was that preparer. John prepared the way for Jesus. Therefore, it is clear that Jesus is saying that he is, in fact, the Messiah. Verse 11, he says, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist. That's how great Jesus is. You know, Jesus offers more praise for John the Baptist than he does for any other person. Although we're not blessed with seeing all of the things that John did and all of the trouble and turmoil that John went through in order to try to prepare the way for Jesus, nevertheless we do see how special John was in the eyes of Jesus and how much Jesus loved John. What a tremendous statement that Jesus makes about John. None born of women greater than John. Jesus, however, adds some interesting information to the end of that statement in verse 11. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Now there are at least three observations that we need to make from this. First of all, John was not in the kingdom as Jesus is speaking of the kingdom here. Now this would be a good example of a passage where the kingdom certainly must mean the church. John was in the rule of God. He was in the kingdom of God in the greater sense. But John was not in the kingdom. That's how, as great a man as he was, there are those that are going to be greater than he who are in the kingdom. The one who is least in the kingdom is greater than he. And then a second observation is that the kingdom and its establishment were yet future. John preached in chapter 3 and verse 2 that the kingdom was at hand or was near, and yet it's not here yet. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18, actually going through verse 19, Jesus says, I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom. So the kingdom is something that is yet to come. I will build my church. The church had not been built yet. Its establishment, its building was yet future. If it had been built at this point, if the church was in existence at this point, certainly John would have been in the church. But the church was not established at this point. Jesus had yet to build the church, and of course the church became established on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. All right, so this is an example of where the context helps us. And then a third observation, all who will be in the kingdom or the church will have a position greater than that of John. It's a blessing to be a part of Christ's church, to be the bride of Christ. Those that preceded the time of Christ did not have the blessings that we have today of being a part of the glorious church. It is the church, according to Ephesians chapter 5, that Jesus is going to present to himself. It's the church, according to Ephesians 5, that Jesus is going to save. It's the church, according to Acts chapter 20, that Jesus purchased with his blood. The church is a very, very special part of God's plan. It was that which was eternally planned by God, according to Ephesians chapter 3. And so when we think of what Jesus is saying here, he's letting them know just how important the kingdom, the church, is. And that's how we know that this context is certainly talking about the church. John was not in the church, in the kingdom, in the sense that Jesus uses the word kingdom here. And so if you're in the kingdom, the least in that kingdom is still greater than John. And John would have appreciated that fact because John knew how great the church was in the plan of God. Well, what a blessing we have, and I hope that we appreciate the blessing that we have to be on this side of the cross, on this side of the establishment of God's kingdom. Even Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 1 that the gospel age, the age that we live in, was the time that angels long to look. Jesus goes on to say in verse 12, and from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and violent men want to take it by force. There are people that totally misunderstand what the kingdom of heaven is all about. They totally misunderstand what the kingdom that the Messiah is going to set up is going to be like. And so they try to take it by force in order to try to set up this kingdom. Now, in the Gospel of John, chapter 6 and verse 15, we see that there are those that are trying to take Jesus and make him king by force. This is what he's talking about right here. There are people that are trying to rush things and trying to set up things the way they would like it to be set up. This is not at all what Jesus wants. When we look at this verse, it can, the tense of the verbs can be altered a little bit, where it's saying that the kingdom is being forcibly entered. There are people that are trying to be a part of God's plan, to be a part of God's kingdom and force their way into it. They want to be in it on their terms, not on God's terms. There's only one way that you could get into the kingdom of God. You remember what that is? The only one way that you could be pleasing to God to the extent that He would allow you to be a part of His family or His kingdom. And that's through obedience by doing the will of the Father who is in heaven. All right, so those people that are trying to take it by force are those people that are trying to establish the kingdom on their own terms, not on God's terms. And so Jesus says there are lots of people out there that are trying to do their own will rather than be subject to the will of God, especially when it comes to the setting up of the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 and 21, when the mother of James and John, they are trying to seize for themselves authority by getting the right hand, sitting on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus. They're trying to seize for themselves that power. Well, that's not what Jesus wants. That's not the kind of people that Jesus wants to have. He wants people to be servants and have a servant attitude. All right, he says in verse 13, "For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John." Here in this verse we see that there was an awful lot that led up to John, that the prophets and the law, they were bringing us up to the beginning of the work of John. John was the one that initiated the great plan that all the Old Testament was striving or was reaching toward. He says in verse 14, "And if you care to accept it, He Himself is Elijah who was to come." Now this is as clear a statement as we're going to find that John was the Elijah. Now we mentioned earlier that Jesus quotes Malachi 3:1 about the preparer. Now we go a couple of verses later in Malachi to chapter 4 verse 5, and he says, "Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and the terrible day of the Lord." All right, so the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord had to do with John and the coming of John. And God's judgment upon people by sending the Messiah. So you have the preparer. Jesus says as clearly as it could be said that John was the Elijah who was to come. All right, verse 15. "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." If you're going to listen to what I have to say, then you need to focus upon those words and listen to what I have to say. Now, God has blessed everybody with ears. We have ears to hear. Since we have ears to hear, let's use those ears. Now, what's interesting about this terminology, and we'll remind ourselves of this when we get to chapter 13, that in the Hebrew language, the word hear and obey were the same words. If you obeyed, you heard. If you did not obey, then you never really heard in the first place. So he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Jesus is saying hear and obey, respond, follow. Because if you do not do what God's Word says, then Jesus would say, well, you never heard in the first place. There are other contexts that are going to be using this same terminology, especially to the 7 churches of Asia. In the book of Revelation, Jesus is going to be saying to those 7 churches about if you got ears to hear, you should hear. Let him hear. Verse 16, "But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces who will call out to other children." All right, here's a question. Jesus says, let's analyze what it's like in this generation. Okay? It's like a bunch of children that are sitting in marketplaces. And these children call out to other children, and they're calling out saying, let's play. And we say, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge for you, and you did not mourn. All right, doing all sorts of things to get the others to participate and join with them, and they're not doing it. He says, "For John came, neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon." So John did not fit their mold. John did not act, did not dress, did not conduct himself like they thought that he should. Well, verse 19, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax gatherers and sinners. And so now Jesus is the opposite. He's kind of acting like they wanted John to act, to come and be with them and get involved with them. And so here comes Jesus, and that's what Jesus does. Well, what do? They say, a gluttonous man and a drunkard. Can you imagine calling Jesus a glutton? Can you imagine calling Jesus a drunkard and a friend of tax gatherers and sinners? That's what Jesus was being accused of. That's the kind of man that they said that he was. They thought he had a demon. They thought he acted like one that had a demon. Well, the last phrase there says, yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. As time goes on, what Jesus did and how Jesus chose to conduct his life and how John chose to conduct his life is going to be vindicated, because it will prove to be the wisest way to go. Now, we have the advantage of looking back through the pages of the Scriptures and see the way John lived and see the way Jesus lived. And would we not say that John was perfect in his job as a preparer? Would we not look at the life of Jesus, and certainly knowing that Jesus was without sin and was truly perfect in every way, that everything that he did and how he chose to go about dealing with people was the right way to do things. And so wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. You look at John and his disciples, you look at Jesus and their disciples, and you see that they were right in doing it their way, not yielding to what the scribes and the Pharisees thought they should be doing. All right, let's make an application of that for us today. We may not be following the wisdom of the world. There are all sorts of people that have advice on how we ought to be living. We look at all sorts of advertisements that say you need this and you need to wear that and you need to conduct yourself this way. But if we're going to follow the Bible, guess how we're going to be vindicated. It's going to be shown to be wise in the end, because on the day of judgment, God's going to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. The world may think we're smart if we follow them now. They may think we're wise and intelligent if we do what they want done. But we'll be vindicated in the end when we follow God, although the world in the meantime thought we were foolish. Verse 21, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. The word woe was a warning. Look out. Something terrible is about to happen. Chorazin and Bethsaida, Tyre and Sidon are places that are mentioned here by Jesus. As we study in Acts chapter 21 and 27, we see that Tyre and Sidon were cities that were very receptive to the gospel, but Chorazin and Bethsaida, these Jewish cities, were not receptive to the gospel. So you've got Gentile cities that are happy to receive the gospel, whereas these Jewish cities are very reluctant. He says if they had occurred in you, they would have repented long ago. We look at what advantage, what blessings are being given to Chorazin and Bethsaida, and they're not receptive to the gospel. They're receiving things that Tyre and Sidon never received during the ministry of Jesus, although they did receive the gospel later on, as we mentioned in Acts. He says, nevertheless, I say to you, that it shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And he says, and you, Capernaum, now remember that Capernaum was Jesus' hometown, will you not be exalted in and you, Capernaum, will not be exalted to heaven, will you? You shall descend to Hades. For if the miracles had occurred in Sodom, which occurred in you, it would have remained to this day. Capernaum was the most favored of all cities, because Jesus made it his home in Matthew 4 and verse 13. But they're not going to be exalted in the eyes of God, because they were the ones that received all of the blessings that he had to offer. Why? because they received that which others did not receive. All right, we have some more to say about this, and we'll pursue that in our next class.